Hey, I'm Rick Hudock, pastor at West Haven Baptist Church. Welcome to the after party for Sunday, September 6th, 2020. We are beginning a new sermon series today, the Sheeple of God Series. We're going to be looking at passages and concepts from the Bible where we are compared to sheep and God, Jesus, are compared to shepherds. And so it should be a pretty good series. I'm excited about it. I think it's going to open up a lot of the references that are in the Bible to sheep and shepherds and flocks. There are more than we think about. There are more references to sheep and shepherds, God and us, than you may first think. I was kind of shocked when I started to kind of open up this idea of sheep and shepherds and look through the Bible and all the examples and all the references to it. There really are quite a few. So today we're going to look at Hosea chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. And I want to set the stage for this. So Hosea is written during a time written by the prophet Hosea. It's an account of his life. And he was asked by God, or told by God, to go out and marry a woman named Gomer. Now, Gomer was a harlot. She was a prostitute. She was a woman of incredibly loose morals, and it wasn't just a professional thing for her. It was a moral thing as well. She wasn't faithful eventually to Hosea. But God asked Hosea to go out and find a woman like this, and he found Gomer, and God said, marry her. And so Hosea brought her into his house, and eventually, or sooner rather than later, she went back to her old ways, and she became unfaithful and was sleeping around with all kinds of people who weren't her husband, which was Hosea. And so God eventually says to Hosea, okay, I want you to go out and find her. She's hit rock bottom. I want you to find her and bring her back. Forgive her and bring her back. And God said, the reason I'm doing this is because Gomer is Israel. And God said, I am you, Hosea. And Israel has been so unfaithful to me for hundreds of years, over and over and over again, cheating on me, going after other gods, worshiping other gods, loose morals, abandoning God and his ways. And God said, this is a street art, as it were. This is you acting out what I'm doing with the people of Israel. And so at this point in history, Israel was pretty wicked. And God says this in Hosea chapter 2. He says, this is what I'm going to do with Israel. Now, he's laid out all the punishments and really all the consequences of their own sin and turning themselves away from God. And God says this to Hosea, therefore, I'm now going to allure her. I will lead her into the desert and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will sing as in the days of her youth, as in the days that she came up out of Egypt. And so God is saying, I'm going to woo, I'm going to allure, I'm going to court Israel, try to restore our relationship. I'm going to take her out into the wilderness, and there I'm going to speak softly to her, and there I'm going to restore everything. Now, when I say the word wilderness, people have different ideas of what that word means. And really in the Bible, in the English translation, sometimes this Hebrew word, which is a word that means word at the root, means the word word, and it's a place of revelation from God, which is interesting because the root of desert in Hebrew means a word. And so this wilderness, this desert, it's not like a national park. It's not Alaska with all the beautiful mountains and the pines and just the incredible thick forest and things like that. It's not a national forest. The wilderness, the desert, is more like the Sahara Desert, but not quite that arid, because there is some life in the biblical deserts. And in fact, at times, shepherds would lead their sheep into these desert areas. There was enough substance there, enough food, enough water. But it was a tough existence. They really had to work hard to find the food and water. But generally in the Bible, wilderness, desert, it's a wasteland. It's a hostile, rough, scraggly kind of area. It's rugged. There's dangerous terrain. And yet this was often where shepherds would raise their sheep. So hold on to that thought, because that's going to be important as this message unfolds. This is the biblical wilderness that God talks about here. The biblical wilderness where Moses lived and worked, where David ran from Saul and hid, where Israel wandered for 40 years, where David composed some of his most powerful psalms. Jesus prayed and spent time with God for 40 days in this desert wilderness type of area after he was baptized by John the Baptist. It's fierce and it's inhospitable. And yet this is where God often sends us and sent his people as well. Now, it can be really, really hot in this wilderness area. In fact, it can reach up to 125 degrees Fahrenheit in some of these areas. And by the way, I just want to mention that there's a great book by Tim Laniak. It's a 40-day devotional book. It's called While Shepherds Watch Their Sheep. It's about leadership. It's a devotional for leaders. And a lot of the facts and information that I present today come from him. So I just want to give credit to Tim Laniak for this. So daytime in this wilderness desert area can reach at times 125 degrees, but winter can be freezing. In fact, in the winter of 1945 to 1946, nomads in Algeria lost half of their herd, their flocks of sheep, lost half of them to freezing weather in the wintertime. So it can get very cold there as well. When the wilderness is not super hot or deadly cold, there's also drought. Years may pass by with only drops of dew for moisture. That's really the only moisture that an area like this might see for years at a time. In fact, between 1958 and 1961, shepherds in Syria lost 50% of their sheep to rainless winters. So the wilderness, the desert, can be very dangerous for sheep. Some sheep will survive and thrive in this area. Others will perish. It's just the nature of that area. And then there are the horrific sandstorms, which can blow wildly for days at a time. And such storms like this can decimate any living thing that's unprotected. And really, you can imagine a sandstorm like this can just sap the strength of a soul. And yet, what we see from the lives of Jesus, Moses, and David is that the wilderness can be a spiritual oasis. It's kind of contradictory, desert, but a spiritual oasis, but it can be. The wilderness experience of these people and others was a time where God called these people to himself, where he gave them revelation, and where their intimacy with God was developed. And so think about that. The wilderness can be an area of calling, revelation from God, and intimacy. One of the things that I'm praying for the people in our church and anyone I have an opportunity to pray for during this time, during this COVID time. And it's sort of a desert wilderness experience. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But one of the things that I pray for, two of the things that I pray for, is that God, during this time, God will reveal new things about himself to the people I'm praying for. And also that God will reveal new things about them, the people, as well. So my prayer for anybody, for myself and anybody, is that God will show us new things about himself and new things about ourselves. So what we see from these guys, Jesus, Moses, David, is that the wilderness is an area of revelation, calling, and intimacy. And that's why God is calling Hosea, or in Hosea, God is calling Israel out to the desert. Now, I don't know about you, but the first time I took my wife, Kathy, out, I took her out to a wonderful, very interesting restaurant. It was a former church that had been converted into a restaurant in Norfolk, in the Norfolk area. And, I'm so spiritual, I'm such a pastor, that I even take my dates, my first date with my wife to a former church that became a restaurant. But anyhow, I don't know about you, but I put on a nice shirt, nice slacks. I splashed some nice smelling stuff on my face and my neck, put on deodorant. It was an iron shirt. It was just, I presented myself. I combed my hair. I had more of it at the time, but I combed my hair and I presented myself as nicely as I could. And I took her to a nice place and we had pleasant conversation. It really was a beautiful, wonderful time. I'll never forget it. But so then why is God taking Israel, if he's trying to woo her back to him, trying to woo his unfaithful wife back to him, why isn't he taking her to a nice place? He's taking her to the desert. And this is why God is taking her to the desert. Because this was the place where they first met. When God brought Israel out of Egypt, where did he take them? To the wilderness, to the desert. And how long were they there? 40 years. And listen, God was getting them ready. It took 40 years for God to get them ready to take the promised land. They weren't ready yet. So it was there in the desert at Mount Sinai when he gave the Ten Commandments and the law, where they built the tabernacle, which is kind of a portable temple. And God established his relationship with Israel. It was there in a wilderness area. And so God's bringing Israel back to a wilderness area. And basically what this meant for Israel is they were being conquered and taken and captive and spread out all over that part of the world at the time. This was a place where God knew that they would look up and say, you know what? Everything else has been stripped away. Everything else. Here in the wilderness, in the desert, everything else has been stripped away. I really need you, Jesus. I really need you, God. And that's what he was doing. Taking them to a place where they realized, or really, allowing them to take themselves to this place. And it was there that he met them and said, okay, I want you to see, I want you to realize, I want you to know that you really need me. Everything else is stripped away. There's just me and you. That's what God was saying. The wilderness is where Moses was humbled. David was prepared. Israel was purified. And Jesus solidified his calling and intimacy with the Father. By the way, Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus was in the wilderness after the baptism by John for 40 days. There's a parallel there. There's some symbolism there that's very important. Jesus responded to God the way that God hoped that Israel would respond to him, and the way that he hopes we will respond to him when we're in the wilderness, when we're in the desert. What God shows us here in Hosea is that only in the wilderness, that remote, isolated environment, would the people be able to understand God's love for them when everything else was gone, when they were living just subsistence kind of level, basic level, just surviving. God still loved them, and they desperately needed him. Deserts quickly bring us to the end of our self-sufficiency and independence. Now, where's the wilderness for you? And I want to say this. It's not so much a place, a physical location, because a person can have everything but inside be dry and desolate. Really what I think God has for us today, and if I'm symbolizing this a little bit, what happened to Israel and applying it to us. God, for us, the wilderness can be an emotional or spiritual desert. So it may not be a physical place, because a person may have everything, all the toys, all the blessings, and yet be desolate inside. Or a person may have nothing or very little and still be filled up with joy and the Lord inside. And so this is really our desert, our wilderness is really a place of emotional or spiritual distress. And while the wilderness is not where we want to live, there are times when God leads us to the wilderness so that he can get our attention, or he allows us to wander into the desert so that he can then get our attention. And remember, the wilderness, the emotional and spiritual wilderness, is a place of calling, revelation about God, and intimacy with God. The wilderness really is a precious place to be with God. Now, what might the wilderness or the desert look like for you? Well, the COVID-19, I think, situation is a desert experience. And when it first happened, I realized I'm not suffering. I mean, there was a time when I thought I might have COVID and I didn't feel very, very well, and it turned out to be something else. And so there can be physical danger here, of course. But I realized that most people still have their homes, have money from the government, still have a lot of them still have jobs. We're able to protect ourselves. We have our internet. We have all the accoutrements and all the comforts of modern life. And so things aren't really that bad for most of us. But I've come to change my view on this, because I've realized that in my own life there is a constant low-level anxiety. I'm worried about, will I get sick? Will one of my loved ones get sick? Am I wearing my mask right? Oh, shoot, did I forget my mask at home again? What am I going to do? I have to turn around and go back and get it. I'm worried about the economy. I'm worried about the election. I'm concerned. And when I say worried, there's this level of anxiety there. I'm concerned about the riots. All these things that I think are related to this time of angst for us as a world, and certainly as a nation. And I realize that there's a constant level of low-grade anxiety in my life. And so for many people, this is a wilderness time. This is a desert time. For some people, the empty nest. Sent our last child off to college, or sent our last child out into the workforce. They're no longer living with us. This can be a time of loneliness. In fact, loneliness, whatever the cause, can be a real desert experience for many of us. Loneliness and emptiness that we might feel inside. For some people, it's retirement. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? Some people, it's the job that they're in right now. I remember there was a time when I was considering my call into ministry, and I was working as a consultant in the Washington, D.C. area, and flying high in some respects. We were called the Beltway Bandits. We did good work, but the nickname was Beltway Bandits because we made a lot of money with the federal government. And it was all legit. Don't worry, it was all legit. But I was kind of flying high at this time. And I remember during a 2-year period when I sensed the call of God upon my life for ministry and was training for that and equipping myself and getting ready to make the jump into, at the time, street ministry and living by faith for a number of years. That 2-year period, I hated going to work. And the people there were fine and the work was fine, but I hated going to work. And it wore me out. Every day on my way in, I was like, I got to go and do this work that I wasn't called any longer to do and that I wasn't finding fulfillment in. And so for me, and so this was a desert wilderness time for me as well. So it can be your job. There could be medical issues that are leading you into the wilderness. You could have a wandering heart. That is, your heart may not be focused on your first love, which is Jesus Christ. And there may be a time of wilderness or desert roaming. Here's what I want to encourage you to do or not to do. Don't run from your wilderness experience. Now, nobody likes being in the desert, emotionally and spiritually. It's horrible. And most of us think, I just want to get through it. I want to get to the other side. I'm tired of riding through the desert on a horse with no name. I want to get out of the desert. And that's natural. None of us like it. But don't try to run from the desert times. Look to God and say, God, why am I here? Don't try to just get through it, just to survive and get through it. See what God might have for you. Does he have a calling for you? Does he have revelation for you? Is he preparing you for something? Does he want a deeper intimacy in his relationship with you? Don't ignore the desert. Don't try to turn it aside. In fact, make it a profitable time for you. God has us in the wilderness when he does for a purpose. He may have lured us there, allured us there. He may have called us there, wooed us there. He may meet us there, whatever the case is. He has a purpose for it. It's rough in the wilderness. And sometimes sheep die in the heat or the sandstorms or the cold or the thirst or the starvation. Sometimes some sheep will die in the wilderness. But most of us will live and be stronger. The rest of us will learn, however, that when a shepherd leads his sheep into the desert, he intends to feed them, to protect them, to provide for them, to bless them, to make them fruitful. It's when they wander away that there's a problem. God is loyal to us as our shepherd, so loyal to us. He protects us. He shepherds us wonderfully. He provides for us and he protects us. And when he finally leads us out of the wilderness, as he always will, we will never be the same again. Amen.